Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next installment of our combination product series. My name is Anna Mearson, and I lead commercial services here at Biologics Consulting. We are a dedicated end-to-end FDA regulatory consulting organization, and we support all elements of the regulatory pathway and for device and drug organizations seeking registration in the US market. Our devices capabilities span combination products, dedicated devices, and software as a medical device. And this is part 3 of the series, and the webinar will highlight key information on the regulatory landscape for combination products, incorporating software, as well as highlight what is needed from a documentation standpoint to support FDA regulatory submissions. We'll also provide a high-level overview of cybersecurity considerations. Our speakers today are Anshul Chanduri and Becky Diddy. Anshul is a senior consultant on our medical devices team. She has over 15 years experience in the devices space and combination product space, and her experience includes 13 years at the FDA, followed by over 4 years in consulting with experience in drug delivery product submissions. Becky is also a senior consultant on our devices team. She has over 20 years of industry experience in the medical device regulatory affairs space and has been with Biologics since 2017. Her focus area is on devices that are software or have software components. And prior to Biologics, Becky held roles of increasing responsibility in the regulatory affairs group at Stryker Instruments. I will be moderating questions for a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so please type your questions in the chat feature. And now we'll advance to the agenda slide. Thank you, Nicholas. And I'll briefly go over today's agenda. So as highlighted in my introduction, Anshul will kick things off with an overview of software that is used in relation to or with prescription drugs. Then we'll go over what software functions are regulated by the CDRH, and talk about the FDA's draft guidance on prescription drug use related software. Becky will then dive into the type of documentation needed for regulated software and cybersecurity considerations, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So I will now hand it over to Anshul to kick things off with an overview of software used for prescription drugs.
Thank you, Anna. So first, let's talk about how and why software is being used with prescription drugs. There are 2 main buckets in how this is being done. One is software such as mobile apps that are optionally prescribed with a drug or drug-led combination product. And these are digital health solutions that have been introduced to help with things like better adherence, management of side effects, or remote monitoring. And then the second bucket is software that's considered essential to the intended use of a drug-led combination product. So for example, seen here an infusion pump that requires software for dose delivery and other software that could enhance clinical benefit achieved by drug use. In the second case of software that's essential to drug delivery, it's clear that FDA's regulatory purview applies, but it's oftentimes a little less clear in the first case if you have something that can be optionally prescribed. So let's talk about what software is regulated by FDA. FDA has taken the position that they look at individual software functions to determine which are or are not regulated. Regulated software functions are those that meet the definition of a device. This means software functions intended for the diagnosis of disease or the treatment or prevention of a disease, or those that affect the structure or function of the human body. This may include software to be used as an accessory to a regulated product or to transform a computer or a phone into a regulated device. These are considered mobile medical apps, and they can use, for example, a phone's built-in features like a camera to, let's say, diagnose the skin condition. Another regulated software function would be one that allows connection to an existing device for purposes of controlling its operation or function. And this is, for example, if you had a remote control that was able to change the settings of an implantable drug delivery device. And the third example is software functions used for active monitoring or to analyze patient-specific data. So even if you have a product with software functions that fall under the definition of a device, FDA has stated that they only intend to enforce regulation of software functions that pose a patient safety risk if the device were not to function as intended. So for drug-related software, this includes software functions that could adversely impact the amount of medication a patient receives or takes. Software functions that are not regulated by FDA include a whole list of things, and I'm just going to go over a few that are relevant to prescription drug use. Previous slide, please. So software that's not regulated includes things like e-copies of medical materials, functions that allow patients to log, record, track, or make decisions related to general fitness or wellness, and software that allows patients to record health data. This includes things like patient diaries that are used to track medication usage. Additionally, software functions that are only intended to transfer, store, display medical data or results are not considered to be regulated. But it is important to note that this does not include functions intended to generate alarms or prioritize data to be viewed for monitoring. And finally, software functions are excluded from FDA's regulatory oversight if they are for clinical decision support and allow healthcare professionals to independently review the basis of recommendations. So now that you hopefully have a bit of a better understanding of what type of software functions are regulated by FDA, let's talk about FDA's draft guidance on regulatory considerations specific to prescription drug use related software. So it's important to understand that this guidance does not go over what software functions are regulated, which is what we just talked about, but instead this guidance focuses on how software outputs are regulated. It describes how FDA will apply its drug labeling authority to software outputs from software that's used with a prescription drug or drug-led combination product. The scope of this guidance is on software that, one, is disseminated by a drug sponsor, and two, produces an end user output that is related to a drug product. And an end user output is really just any material that the software presents to the end user. This can be a screen display, but it could also include sounds, alarms, audio messages, anything that is displayed by the software. And FDA notes that in this guidance that they intend to regulate these prescription drug use related software outputs as labeling. This is true regardless of whether or not the software itself is regulated as a device. And FDA recognizes two broad categories of prescription drug labeling. Required labeling and promotional labeling. So when a software function requires regulatory review, the PDUR's outputs will be considered required labeling. And when the software function doesn't require regulatory review, its output is regulated as promotional labeling. To determine if regulatory review would be applied, in addition to determining whether or not the software function meets the device definition, FDA plans to consider these three questions. The first, if the software output relies on data directly transferred from the device constituent part of a combination product. So for example, if you have an app that displays information taken from your inhaler or infusion pump, that would be a device-connected software function. FDA will also consider if the software provides a function that is essential to the safe and effective use of the product, and or if there's evidence to support a clinical benefit when the PDURS is used. These questions are generally taken all together, but in most cases, if the answer to any one of them is yes, the software output would be considered required labeling. For device connected PTWRS functions, FDA will assess whether the combination product used with the software accurately and reliably can function. So drug sponsors will need to provide such data as part of their marketing application. And FDA also recommends that as part of this data, sponsors show how the software will not lead to medication errors. So if you're designing software to be used with your prescription drug or combination product, where do you begin with your software documentation? So first, you want to clearly identify which of your software functions are regulated and which are not. And it's important to determine the scope early in development and also make it very clear to FDA. In your design development documentation, you'll want to clearly separate out your non-regulated software functions into their own documents and discuss how these functions interface with any regulated software functions. Additionally, if the software itself, in the software itself, you'll want to segregate the regulated and non-regulated functions as much as possible. And then it's important not to forget about cybersecurity. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Becky Diddy, to discuss the regulated software requirements in more detail.
Thank you, Angel. This section will talk about some of the key guidances and standards that you're going to use as you venture into the software world of things. There is a lot there. We are going to talk about it at a very high level. We won't get into the details of every single document, but we'll give you an overview that you can then take back and be able to look for those details yourself. Next. Okay. So some of the key software guidances as you're doing a submission is going to be this one in the center, the content of pre-market submissions for device software functions. You'll also want to be factoring in the off-the-shelf software use in medical devices. If you are using off-the-shelf software in your devices and your software, sometimes people are using libraries or operating systems. Additionally, you'll want to pay attention to policy for device software functions and mobile medical device applications. So as Angel previously said, there is software that may not be regulated. This document will help you understand what you need to explain about that unregulated software in your submission. Any risks that it may or may not pose to the regulated software or the medical device are topics that you will want to discuss in your submission. Next slide, please. Oops. Okay. Additionally, we'll touch on some of the main cybersecurity guidance documents. There is one that is regarding pre-market submissions, and then one for post-market. However, the post-market one factors into your pre-market submission because your pre-market submission for cybersecurity guidance document talks about having plans for managing your cybersecurity risks post-market. And those details will, details you want to provide about that will be called out in the post-market guidance. These are some other guidance documents for you to be aware of. I'm not going to go into depth on any of them. You'll be able to have this presentation, as Anna said, after the call, and you'll be able to go back and look at this slide. As you go through your software, developing software, the first thing you want to do is establish a software development process specifically. And that is going to or should follow IEC 62304. So you'll want to become familiar with that standard. Additionally, you'll want to be familiar with the risk management of medical device standard, ISO 14971, as that's going to guide you on your risk management process. IEC TR 80002-1 is going to tell you, give you guidance on how to apply 14971 specifically to software risks, which sometimes are addressed a little bit differently than hardware risks. And as you go into cybersecurity, you also need to develop a secure development framework within your quality system for your software and your medical device. And IEC 8001-5-1 will help you with that. Now, this is not in the world of cybersecurity and medical devices. There are a lot of new standards constantly being released. There is not one definitive go-to standard for that. However, IEC 8001-5-1 is becoming recognized worldwide, and other regulatory bodies are requiring compliance to that standard. So it will be helpful for you to get familiar with that standard. Now, to go on to the software documentation specifically called out in the pre-market software guidance document. And just to note, when I say software, I'm talking specifically about the software. When I am talking about cybersecurity, I'll be more specific and say cybersecurity. So all of these bullets here are documentation that's going to be required for you to submit if you have regulated software in your submission to FDA. This is the list of those documents. I'm not going to read through this. We are going to touch upon each of these documents in my following slides. Additionally, I have organized my following slides not exactly in order of these bullets, but more in order of me to tell the story of these bullets. But there will be a one-to-one. So when you go back to the presentation after the fact, you'll be able to associate a slide with each of these. As we talked about, the first thing you're going to want to do is set up your software development process, and you're going to want to use the IEC 62304 to do that. This standard will give you 90% of what you need for your software submission. FDA has a couple items in the guidance document that you're going to be specifically developing for the submission that are outside of IEC 62304. And we'll talk about those in a moment. One of the first ones is developing your documentation level evaluation. If you're a combination product, then the guidance states that you are most likely going to be an require enhanced documentation. And those would be products where a hazardous situation with a probable risk of death or serious injury can occur. If your software doesn't fall into that, then you would provide basic documentation. But as I stated before, for combination products, it's going to be enhanced documentation. If you feel that enhanced is not appropriate, that may be something that you discuss with FDA during a pre-sub prior to doing your submission to make sure you understand exactly what's going to be needed. This is not part of the 62304 standard. This is something specific for your submission. And what else is important to know about this is that FDA guidance tells you what you need for a submission. FDA guidance is not telling you what you need for your full software development process. 62304 will have additional requirements that may not be a part of your submission process. They still need to be a part of your quality system. Another item that's specific to FDA guidance document is a software description. This is something you're developing specifically for the submission, where you're giving them an overview of your software. This is what they're going to read first before they dig into any of your software documentation. So you'll want to explain the role of your software and who its intended users are, any analyses or algorithms you have. If you have machine learning algorithms, that has a lot more you have to provide FDA, a lot more details you have to provide FDA on those algorithms. Any features and functions, how is the software hosted? Is it on your hardware platform? Is it on a phone? Do you have a cloud component? Where are the inputs and outputs to your software, be it from other pieces of your hardware, from the user entering in information? So you'll want to give an overview of all of that in your software description. And if your software is and your device is interacting with other devices or the user, you have some interoperability to think about. And that's, anything you're interfacing with, what are the requirements for that? Additionally, you'll provide an off-the-shelf software document, which provides the information identified in FDA's off-the-shelf software use and medical device guidance document. This has questions such as, does the user need to install the off-the-shelf software themselves? What kind of labeling or training does the user need? How do you maintain that off-the-shelf software? So this, again, is not specific to 62304, but it is a specific document you have to provide to FDA in your software submissions. Later on, when we talk about cybersecurity, we'll talk about an SBOM, which is a software bill of material. That identifies all of your off-the-shelf software, providing information such as who manufactured it, what version is it, and then also includes end of support for that software version. So the important thing to note is that people tend to try and address both off-the-shelf software use and medical device guidance requirements and cybersecurity SBOM requirements in the same document. They should not be in the same document. The off-the-shelf software guidance information is really information that designers use, information that FDA cares about. The SBOM is really what you're giving to your users to help them as an additional layer to manage cybersecurity. So they don't necessarily have to wait. If there's a cybersecurity risk that has been identified, has been in the news, they can manage all of the software components that they have in their various devices in a hospital or in a network and be able to see, hey, do I have that component? Do I need to be worried about? If I haven't heard from this medical device provider, do I still need to be thinking about how to maintain safety from this new risk that's been out in the public? So the audience for both of these documents are different, and they really should be different, but they should be consistent. You don't want to be talking about software in one of the documents and not in the other, because they both are covering the same types of software. You'll also have a risk management file, and this will be in accordance with 14971. You'll have three parts to that risk management file. You'll have the plan that identifies who needs to be involved in the risk management process, and how are you evaluating risks on an individual level and as a whole for the device to determine whether or not they're acceptable. Additionally, you'll have an assessment that goes through for each hazardous situation and evaluates it, gives it a score pre-mitigation, and then identifies what are the causes of it. What mitigation measures do you put in place to prevent that from happening? And then after those mitigations, what is the risk level at that point? Some risk items may need a risk benefit analysis to say, even though this is the risk for this item is high, overall the benefit outweighs the risk, and you need to justify that. And then the third component is the report that wraps everything up, that says, hey, we've done what we said we're going to do in the plan. We've done the assessment. This is our risk benefit of why these risks are acceptable. The appropriate people have reviewed it and agreed. Software specifications is going to be the foundation for your software development process. And this is where really 62304 starts with bringing in your software requirement specifications. These need to be very specific. The intent is to do the software requirements early so that then guides the designers and the development of the software. They need to be very specific. Your tests are according to your requirements. So your requirements need to be specific. you will want to say, if you're a device that's taking a recording from a patient, it's not just that the system shall require a recording to be taken, but how long does that recording need to be? Is it 30 seconds? Is it 45? Is it 50? And then you may have a requirement about how, if it's not 30 seconds or if it's longer, what's required at that point? The user needs to take a new recording. And each requirement should be individual. You don't want to stack a bunch of requirements into one requirement. They may have different tests for each of those different features. But this is the foundation. If you don't get your SRS correct, then typically your design documents aren't going to make sense to someone. Your testing isn't going to make sense. And FDA will come back and say, hey, we didn't understand your software requirements, therefore we couldn't really evaluate your design documents and your testing documents. And you don't want to get in that place. So this is why this document is one of the key documents in your software submission. Then you'll be working on your software architecture, which is the roadmap of the design. It's going to talk about your modules and layers. You'll bring in your hardware. Where does your software sit on your hardware? What's the relationship amongst all of this? Where are the data inputs and outputs and the flow of data among, your hardware, your software, and all your various layers and modules? And does any interactions you have outside of the system, and the way you get that information, the interfaces, do you have Wi-Fi? Do you have Bluetooth? So this kind of lays the roadmap out for how your system and your software are going to be laid out. And then you have your architecture design document, and that goes into, that's what I was talking about. And this is an example of what an architecture design figure might look like. This is straight out of the guidance, so you'll be able to see it better in the guidance. And your architecture document may have multiple diagrams, because you may have an overview one and then break down into maybe your cloud platform or your mobile platform, and dig in more into various software modules that you have. And from there, you go into your software design specifications. So to summarize a little bit about what we've talked about, we had our SRS, and that's what the software needs to do. We have our architecture, and that's how everything's going to be laid out. And then you have your SDS, your software design specifications. And what that does is that's how your device does it. So the SRS is the what, and then the SDS is the how. So it's how you actually implemented those requirements. And you want to make sure that there's sufficient information in there so your designers understand what they need to be designing, with minimal ad hoc decisions. You've done all that. Now it's time to test your software. And there are 3 different parts to testing. There's testing you do on the software unit. So as you're developing the software, you're going to be checking it into a system that's housing that software code, and you're going to be doing tests to make sure that that unit is working as you have intended that software unit of code to work. Then you're going to have integration testing, and that's where you have multiple units that talk to each other, that work together. And you're going to do testing to make sure that those units integrate appropriately. And then finally, you have your system level testing. This testing is against all your software requirements. It should be done typically on a final finished device with your final version of software. And you are verifying that all of your requirements, that your device performs as intended and meets all the requirements that you have from your SRS document. What you'll also need to provide to FDA is traceability from your requirements to your design, to your risks, and to your testing. Historically, people have done a traceability matrix, which may look something like what's on the screen below, where you have a line item for every software requirement. And then you identify where the design details about that requirement are. What's the SDS document? What's the section of the SDS? Any risk IDs that software requirement may be mitigating. And then finally, what's the test report and the test case that verifies that software requirement? So that's historically how traceability has been done. I think it's still, as you're working on your design, a good way, especially if you don't have automated systems to help you to track traceability. However, FDA now prefers to see traceability within your documentation itself. And so in your SDS, after various sections, you may have a line item that says this section applies to these specific requirements, and have that throughout your SDS. And in your test reports and your test protocols, for each test case, you identify in that test case which requirements that test case is verifying. In your risk document, when you have mitigation measures, you should trace specifically to the SRS that serves as that mitigation, and then also trace to the test that verifies that mitigation has been implemented appropriately. You will also need to provide a version history of your software. FDA is going to expect that your software testing is done on the final version of software. However, that is not always the case. Your version history is going to talk about your software versions. You may start with your first version that's kind of your first fully functional version. You may have development testing, but none of that testing is in the submission, so you may not have any submission testing associated with it. And then you go and may add some additional features or functions, and you decide, okay, this next version is my big version, my final version, and I'm going to put this in there. And then you do all of your software testing, and you identify that you have some bugs. So you may end up having a third version where you have fixed the bugs that you found in that second version. So that third version is your final finished version. However, you may not have repeated all of your software testing. You may have only done what's called regression testing, where you only tested the parts of the software that changed or could be affected by the change. And so you need to make sure that's explained in the table, and you provide a story after the table that explains why all of the testing that you've done, even if it wasn't on the final finished version, verifies the final finished version, and why some of the earlier testing didn't need to be repeated. And this is for combination products, so this may not be as important, but if you also have hardware components to your device and done testing on hardware, you need to make sure that this story is talking about any other testing that you're doing in the submission that may have included some of your software aspects. If you go and you have a hardware test that required your software on it, but it was done on an earlier version, why did that performance test overall for the device, why didn't that need to be reperformed, even though you wouldn't necessarily call that test a software test? And so you want to make sure the story explains all of that for any of the testing that used your software in the submission. Finally, you'll also have to talk about any unresolved anomalies. As you're doing testing, if you have an unresolved anomaly, you're going to have a process on how to store those, record those anomalies, and address those anomalies. And oftentimes, software does have unresolved anomalies, but you need to explain those to FDA. If you have your software writing the description of the anomaly, what you have in your quality system may not be understandable to someone outside of your company. So make sure the description you're providing in the submission can be understood by someone not familiar with your device. You also want to evaluate that anomaly and any impact it has on the device's safety and effectiveness, on the device being able to perform its intended use. You can't have serious unresolved anomalies. If there's a risk to the patient, then FDA likely won't accept that unresolved anomaly and will require you to fix it. Where possible, identify any root cause. Make sure that anomaly is traced back to the testing that found it, if it was associated with a test report that you've provided, and any workarounds for that anomaly. So a lot of times labeling will have a troubleshooting section, and in that troubleshooting section, you can identify some workarounds if people run into that problem. So there's a lot of software documentation that you provide. You'll also want to make sure you have a story for that documentation. You're going to want to have a software section in your submission that doesn't just point to these documents, but helps FDA to understand how the documents actually implement the recommendation from their guidances. You'll want to explain, here's my risk plan. In this section of my risk plan, it discusses the criteria for evaluating risks and what's acceptable and not. In this section of my risk plan, it identifies who's responsible for what activities. So you'll want to read through FDA guidance documents. You'll want to pull out those tidbits that FDA say specifically need to be in your documentation, and in your software story, explain to FDA when they look at this document where they can find that information. So that's software. And then there's cybersecurity, which attaches onto software. But cybersecurity doesn't just cover software. There's hardware aspects too, because you have ports on your device. Those ports are hardware and they interact with your software. And so all of that needs to be considered as you're going through cybersecurity. As we talked about previously, there are two main cybersecurity guidance documents: the content for pre-market submission and post-market management. And I explained how the two work together and why you need to be thinking about the post-market management, even as you're doing cybersecurity in your pre-market submission. FDA defines a cyber device, or the FD&C Act defines a cyber device as one that includes software by the sponsor, has the ability to connect to the internet, and contains technological characteristics that could be vulnerable to cybersecurity threats. However, it's important to note that FDA cybersecurity guidance documents are not limited to cyber devices, because even if your device doesn't connect to the internet, it still has cybersecurity risks to it if it's got software, if it's got ports, if the software can be updated, if it has programmable logic. So cybersecurity guidance documents go above and beyond just cyber devices. Typically, if you have software, you have cybersecurity concerns. There are a lot of cybersecurity documents that you need to provide. We're not going to discuss every single one of these. I'm just going to give you a high-level overview that you're going to have a cybersecurity risk management process. This is different than your 14971 risk management that we previously talked about. 14971 focuses on patient user risk. What's the harm? What is a physical clinical harm to a patient or a user based on a risk? Cybersecurity, while it can have patient harm, user harm, and those risks should be in 14971, they also need to be evaluated through cybersecurity risk management. Cybersecurity risk management is focused more than just on harm, where, like, if your data is exposed, that may not physically harm you, but that's still a risk to you. And so cybersecurity risks go beyond patient harm. And that's why you want to make sure that you understand different models for how you can evaluate cybersecurity risks, looking at, there's STRIDE models and CVSS and different models that you're going to want to use, and make sure it's something that is well used in the medical device industry. Don't take something from another industry and implement it if it may not meet the needs for a medical device. You're going to have to justify whatever type of cybersecurity risk management that you've developed. You're going to have to justify that along with any method used for your threat modeling in your submission. Your threat model is going to talk about, based upon the architecture, which we talk about on the right, based upon the architecture and the device design, what are the possible types of threats that could be introduced? And then you assess each of those at a very detailed level in the risk assessment. You'll also have an SBOM that we talked about before that identifies all the software off the shelf and your own developed software and provides information on that along with when end of support for that software is. You may be using a component in your software that has an end of support of next year. If you go and you put that submission in and that end of support ends before your review cycle, FDA may ask you, what are you doing about this? And you may say, oh, that doesn't bring us any risk. FDA may still be concerned and may still require you to update that SBOM component to one that is still supported. You'll also want to do a vulnerability assessment of all of those SBOM components. What are vulnerabilities that off-the-shelf software has? How have you mitigated those in your device? Before, we talked about unresolved anomalies and being able to provide those to FDA. And when you assess those, you also need to assess to FDA whether or not there can be any cybersecurity concerns based upon those unresolved anomalies. And just like with the other software documentation, you're going to want to be able to provide traceability between all of these items. Additionally, you're going to have to tell FDA measures and metrics that you're going to track on your cybersecurity. How many, what type of risks have you identified once it's in the field? How quickly have you been able to patch them and be able to distribute those patches? Things such as that. FDA has specific metrics that they recommend that you track. Again, you're going to have your cybersecurity architecture views, and you're going to make sure that you look at it from a global view, from a multi-patient. Some devices can be used on multiple patients. If that device gets a cybersecurity concern, how could it affect not just the patient it's being used on at that time, but anyone else that may be connected to that device at that point or in the future? Updatability and patchability. What vulnerabilities can come from your updatability and patchability process, and what's the architecture of that? And then your security use case views, which really kind of coincide with your risk assessment and the various threats and harms that you have overall to your device. What's interesting with cybersecurity is you have to provide cybersecurity testing, but unlike regular testing that we're probably used to, cybersecurity testing is done on an ongoing basis. So when you have a device, you typically do a test on it when you've developed it to make sure that it performs according to the requirements. And you do that test once. And as long as that device doesn't change, you may not be redoing that testing. However, with cybersecurity, because there are new threats and vulnerabilities that are continually being identified as time goes on, FDA is expecting that you redo your testing on a regularly identified basis. Testing includes vulnerability testing, penetration testing, and on a side note, penetration testing needs to be done by someone independent from the development team. Typically, companies are using third-party companies to do their penetration testing. And this is where, not only from a software point, but from a physical point, that your testers are trying to break into the device. They're really trying to break into the device from a cybersecurity aspect to see if they can succeed and if there's a vulnerability. So this isn't like testing to requirements. This is a whole different type of testing, and you have to do it on an ongoing basis. The guidance document has probably 15 or more bullets of cybersecurity labeling that you need to include in your manuals. You'll want to go through and identify each of those requirements and identify to FDA where it is in your labeling. If one of those labeling requirements isn't applicable to you, don't just skip it. Keep it still still put it in your submission, but provide a justification as to why it's not applicable in your labeling. Otherwise, they're very likely to come back and say, hey, we didn't see you address this and this in your labeling. Why not? Well, at that point, then you have to try and justify why it's not applicable and hope that, they agree with you. Additionally, you have to have cybersecurity management plans, which is how you're going to manage cybersecurity overall and in the post-market world. FDA requires you to have, actually regulation requires you to have two processes, an ongoing regular cycle of updating your software. For some people, this may be quarterly, maybe every 6 months or annually, but then there's an out of cycle update, and that is when you find cybersecurity vulnerability that you need to address. How quickly are you going to do it? What's your plans for that? What's the timeline? Both of those cycles need timelines associated with them. And you also need to identify how you're going to communicate that information and those patches to your users. So as you can see, there is a lot of cybersecurity documentation that is required. So you're going to need to have a cybersecurity expert on your team. This isn't something that traditional software developers, they all have their niche areas, and cybersecurity is a niche area. So you're likely to need to have a cybersecurity expert. Make sure you're addressing all of these elements very clearly in your submission. We've already talked about the SBOM and the penetration testing and traceability. As I mentioned earlier, cybersecurity is beyond device design. You, as part of your cybersecurity processes, you also need to identify how you're keeping that software secure as you're developing it. What internal systems are you using? How are you managing permissions? How do you know you've downloaded the correct software onto the device during the manufacturing process? Or if a user's doing it themselves, how do they know? So it's beyond just device design. We talked about labeling, and I also want to mention that cybersecurity expectations are only going to increase. What FDA expects today versus what they expect a year ago or 2 years ago, and what they'll expect next year and the years beyond, it's constantly changing. The more we learn, the more vulnerabilities that come out, the more FDA expects from manufacturers of software. And what's really important to note is that FDA has the ability to not grant, clear, approve, whatever type of submission it is and what's done, solely based on cybersecurity concerns. Everything else can be perfectly fine, but if they have cybersecurity concerns, they can reject your submission purely on that. So don't take cybersecurity lightly. Also, don't wait till the end to do cybersecurity. You need to be implementing cybersecurity from the beginning. Patching on cybersecurity mitigations at the end typically does not provide good cybersecurity protection. So in summary from this webinar, it's imperative to determine if your software functions are regulated. And then if they aren't, you still need to describe the software outputs in your labeling for combination products. And for regulated software products, make sure that you are providing all the software documentation, that you're typically falling into the enhanced documentation level. And if you think it's something less than that, then you really should discuss that in a pre-submission with FDA. And then cybersecurity really pretty much applies to any device if it's got software. So there was a lot there. We will be providing you the recording afterwards for you to go back and listen to it at maybe a slower speed. But I feel that it was important to introduce you to all of these aspects. So when you start this process, you realize just how much there is and everything that you need to be thinking about.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you, Anshul. Now we're going to open it up for Q&A, so please type your questions in the chat if you have any.
Thanks, Luana.
Anyone have any questions for Anshul or Becky?
It was a lot. I'm sure it takes time to digest all of the information.
Of course, of course. So we have one question here. For PDURs. There are many examples out there for FDA required labeling, such as drug used together with a device like an auto injector. Can you name any public example for an FDA required labeling in which a drug and a mobile app, no device, are mentioned because the app was able to provide meaningful clinical impact to the drug?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I can't think of one off the top of my head, but we can get back to you on that. Um, Oftentimes the FDA creates these guidances with an eye towards the future, even though something hasn't necessarily been done yet. It may be that there's something like this in the pipeline that they've seen, even though it may not have been actually approved yet. But yeah, that's something interesting to look into that we could look into at the FDA database to check on.
Thanks, Anshul. And Oliver will be in touch with a follow-up. Anyone else have questions in the last couple minutes that we have here with Anshul and Becky? All right, if there are no more questions, I'd like to thank everybody for your participation and for joining us today. As mentioned, we'll be in touch with the recording of the webinar. This is part 3 in the series. There are 4 parts in total. So we'll provide more information as well on future webinars in this space for combination products. But on behalf of Biologics, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to speaking with you again in the future.